What if the biggest economic story of our time isn't the one you're being told? What if the political theater in Washington is just a distraction, a smokescreen designed to hide a much more profound and permanent shift in global power? A shift that is being engineered not just by foreign rivals, but by powerful forces right here at home. Today, we're not just going to scratch the surface. We're going to peel back the layers on a series of events that, when connected, paint a disturbing picture of the future of the American economy and your investments. Stay with us.
Today we're going to talk about the U.S. trade war with China. It's an overwhelmingly important economic reality of our times. We're going to be talking about the layoff of government workers, another important reality of our times. We're going to talk about a real serious decline in the McDonald's hamburger business, which is part of what's happening to retail across America and needs to be understood. And finally, the relationship changing between the United States and Europe, speaking economically. So let's begin. I'm going to start with a very short segment. It's a story of something that began 8 years ago in 2017. At that time, it was President Trump's first term as president, and he hit China, as we all remember, with tariffs. And about the time he hit them with tariffs, they were, of course, much less then than he is doing now. But when he did it, it was remarkable enough, since other countries weren't behaving this way. He also made a point of touring a factory in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, I believe, in Pennsylvania. And he went in particular to the Ames True Temper plant, which it turned out made 85% of all the wheelbarrows sold in the United States. So he went to the manufacturing center for wheelbarrows, which every gardener and every farmer needs and uses all the time. And as I say, it was the Ames True Temper plant. Well, a few years later, a venture, or maybe they should be called vulture, capitalist swooped in and bought that company from its original owners. The venture capitalist Griffon Corporation, 2023, bought it. They then did what venture and vulture capitalists often do. Sold it for parts, broke it up as a corporation, and sold the different parts of it for more money than it was worth as a wheelbarrow company. Today, just so you know, the overwhelming majority of wheelbarrows, which still carry the name True Temper, like in the old days of Ames, but they now have under the word True Temper, made in China. That's how it's done, friends. And all the statements to the opposite, all the camera pictures taken of Mr. Trump at the Ames True Temper factory was all window dressing for an underlying reality that is exactly the opposite. That has not stopped. That's why I'm telling you the story.
This wheelbarrow story isn't just a nostalgic anecdote about a bygone era of American manufacturing. It is a perfect, clinical case study of how the modern financial system actually works, and it's a brutal lesson for investors. The speaker uses the term vulture capitalist, but on Wall Street, they're known as private equity firms, and their business model is often asset stripping. A firm like Griffon Corporation doesn't buy a company like Ames True Temper because they have a passion for making better wheelbarrows. They buy it because they see it as a collection of assets that are worth more dead than alive. They look at the brand name, the real estate the factory sits on, the machinery, the distribution contracts, and the pension fund. They calculate that by breaking the company into pieces and selling them off individually, a process called liquidation or asset stripping, they can generate a higher return for their investors than by running the company as a going concern. The brand name, True Temper, is valuable, so they sell that to another entity who can slap it on a product made in China for a fraction of the cost. The factory is closed, the workers are laid off, and the land is sold to a real estate developer. The machinery is sold for scrap. What happened to Ames is the story of what happened to countless iconic American brands. From an investment perspective, this is a critical warning. When you see a private equity firm take over a legacy manufacturing company, it's rarely a signal of impending innovation or a return to glory. More often than not, it's the beginning of the end. It's a financial sleight of hand that enriches the partners at the private equity fund while dismantling the productive capacity of the country, one wheelbarrow factory at a time. The political promises of bringing manufacturing back are meaningless against the immense profitability of taking it apart.
Now, some people justify the United States' behavior towards China by using the word Cold War. That is, we are entering, or already in, a Cold War against China, by which those folks mean we're about to do to China what the Cold War did to our enemy then, the Soviet Union. Now, true enough, the Cold War did eventually contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And so you can see a kind of logic. Gee, the Cold War, in which we surrounded the Soviet Union with military bases, we didn't do much trade with them, we badmouthed them every chance we got, etc., 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 seemed to work to help bring the end of the Soviet Union. So there's a kind of crude logic. Gee, let's do it again, this time to our current enemy, the People's Republic of China. But this crude logic runs up against a problem. The conditions are very different, and I want to go through them because I think it'll show you why a strategy of Cold War, and once again we have bases around the People's Republic of China. The 7th Fleet of the U.S. Navy sits in the South China Sea, right offshore. We continue to talk about Taiwan, which has been part of China for hundreds of years, as something that we might not allow the Chinese to take and integrate into their country, even though for most of the last 50 years, the U.S. has agreed that there's only one China, not two of them, and that therefore Taiwan is part of China.
Here, Richard makes a critical point that is almost always lost in the political noise. He's arguing that the Cold War 2.0 strategy against China is doomed to fail because the entire premise is flawed. The analogy to the Soviet Union is fundamentally broken from a financial and economic standpoint. The Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies represented a largely isolated and self-contained economic bloc. They were not integrated into the global capitalist system. In fact, their entire ideology was based on being an alternative to it. The West could wage a Cold War against the USSR by containing it, because there was very little economic symbiosis. Sanctioning the USSR hurt them, but it had a relatively minor impact on the day-to-day operations of Western economies. China is the polar opposite. It is not an isolated alternative to the global system. For the last 30 years, it has become the system's indispensable core. It's the world's factory floor. Your iPhone, your Nike shoes, your car parts, the active pharmaceutical ingredients in your medicine, the list is endless. To treat China like the Soviet Union isn't just a flawed strategy, it's an act of massive economic self-harm. From an investor's perspective, this is the single most important geopolitical reality to understand. The stock prices of the largest companies, from Apple to Tesla to Nike, are completely dependent on this deep integration with China, both as a manufacturing base and as a massive consumer market. The political rhetoric of decoupling is a fantasy. A genuine economic Cold War with China wouldn't just hurt China, it would trigger an immediate and catastrophic collapse in corporate profits for a huge portion of the American stock market. The comparison to the Soviet Union isn't just crude logic, it's a dangerously ignorant fantasy that ignores the fundamental structure of the global economy.
But nonetheless, saber-rattling happens, and we have alliances directed against China, and so forth and so on. Why, nonetheless, do I want you to think about this argument? After World War I, after the Russian Revolution that established the Soviet Union in 1917, and really again after World War II, Russia, the Soviet Union, was alone. No other countries had a successful revolution. Other countries had these revolutions in 1917, like the one in the Soviet Union. They often called themselves Soviet revolutions. They happened in Budapest, Hungary, in Munich, Germany, in Hamburg, Germany, and so on. But Russia emerged as the only place where such a communist socialist revolution succeeded. And even after World War II, when they did acquire the Eastern European cordon from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, it was a very small group of nations isolated in a bigger world. I'm afraid you can't make the same claim today. China is not alone. China is not the only place where this kind of a revolution has succeeded. North Korea is one. Vietnam is another. Cuba is another. And not only that, the Chinese have worked in a way the Russians either didn't or couldn't to create an enormous alliance, the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, a reality that gets way too little attention in the United States, perhaps because our alliances are in such bad shape, given Canada and Mexico and Europe, that it's painful to recognize how much better shape the Chinese are with their BRICS alliance. Then, over the last 40 years, as we've talked about in other programs, the United States lost its manufacturing base. Yeah, but China got one. China built up its manufacturing base, so it's now the largest manufacturing base anywhere in the world. No comparison with anybody. They got it. We lost it. That was never the situation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And not only that, because of their size, and because of the fact that over the last 10 years, China has worked very hard to develop its internal market, raising the wages of its workers so they could afford to buy all that their manufacturers can sell. You now have a China that is much less dependent on the outer world than it was, whereas the United States has become more dependent on the outer world than it was.
This inversion is the crux of the entire power shift. For decades, the narrative was that China needed the U.S. consumer. Today, the reality is that the U.S. needs China's industrial base far more. The speaker mentions China developing its internal market, but it's crucial to understand what that really means for an investor. This isn't just about Chinese citizens buying more cars and smartphones. It's about China systematically climbing the value chain and creating a closed-loop technological ecosystem. Think about programs like Made in China 2025. The goal is to achieve self-sufficiency in critical technologies like semiconductors, aerospace, and robotics. While America was deindustrializing, offshoring its factories, and financializing its economy, China was doing the exact opposite. They were building, subsidizing, and strategically planning for the long term. At the same time, look at the rise of the BRICS alliance. This isn't just a political talking shop, it's the construction of a parallel economic universe. It has its own development bank as an alternative to the IMF and World Bank. Member countries are increasingly settling trade in their own currencies, not the US dollar. When you combine China's growing domestic market with the enormous collective market of BRICS nations, which, as the speaker notes, includes over half the world's population, you see the endgame. They are building a world where they no longer need the West as the buyer of last resort. The United States, on the other hand, dismantled its industrial capacity. We can't produce enough antibiotics, enough electronics, enough basic goods to sustain ourselves without these global supply chains that run directly through our chief rival. This creates an incredible vulnerability. For investors, this means the risk premium for US-centric assets should be going up, not down. The belief that US markets are the only safe haven is based on a 20th century reality that no longer exists.
So in all these ways, waging a Cold War against China is a large mistake. It draws on an equivalence between the Soviet Union before 1990 and China after, and that's not correct in a crucial set of economic variables. And let me summarize it with what ought to be the clincher statistic of them all. The United States, rich country that it is home for 4.5% of the people on this planet. 4.5%. That's what our 330 million fellow Americans amount to. China and the BRICS, China and the carefully cultivated alliance it has, includes more than 50% of the people on this planet are gathered in the alliance of the Chinese. Even if you add Europe and North America, Canada, Mexico, the United States doesn't come close. And I want to remind you, Russia and China together have a nuclear arsenal equivalent to that of the United States. The world has radically altered. The Cold War that the United States could and did wage effectively is not available now. And to try to proceed as if it were, well, here's the kind of mistake you'll make. In February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The United States said, we're going to hit you with a mother of all sanctions. We won't allow you to sell your oil and gas in Europe. We will hamper you with your shipping and your money, and we'll take $300 billion of your assets and freeze them. And what did they say this would do? Bring Russia to its knees. That's a quote. Turn the ruble into rubble. Another quote. Did any of that happen? No. None of it. Ruble's worth more now than was then. Russia's economic growth over the last year is the envy of all of Europe. No one in Europe has done as well as the Russians while they fight a war. You know what the mistake was? Didn't understand that Russia was part of BRICS. When they couldn't sell their oil and gas to Europe, instead of that being a punishment, they just pivoted and sold their oil and gas to India and China. thereby paying for the war, which they are winning.
The failure of the sanctions against Russia is perhaps the most stark and recent proof that the old economic playbook is obsolete. The West, led by the US, believed it could cripple Russia by cutting it off from the SWIFT payment system and banning its energy exports to Europe. This was supposed to be the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb. It was meant to turn the ruble into rubble. It failed spectacularly. Why? Because of the parallel system we just discussed. Russia didn't collapse because it simply pivoted. It rerouted its energy flows to its BRICS partners, India and China, who were more than happy to buy discounted Russian oil and gas. They didn't need dollars or the SWIFT system to do it. They could use their own currencies or other mechanisms. The outcome was a strategic disaster for the West. Russia's economy stabilized and grew, funded by these new energy sales. Europe, on the other hand, deindustrialized. By cutting itself off from cheap Russian gas, Germany, the industrial engine of Europe, plunged itself into a recession from which it has not recovered. They were forced to buy much more expensive liquefied natural gas, or LNG, much of it from the United States, permanently raising their energy costs and making their industries uncompetitive. For an investor, the lesson is profound. Geopolitical pronouncements from Washington are not economic reality. The world is no longer unipolar. You cannot sanction a major commodity producer when there's an entire block of powerful nations willing and able to be a customer. This event exposed the limits of the dollar's power and the weaponization of finance. It proved that commodities are fungible and will always find a market. Smart money now understands that the world is divided, and you have to analyze capital and resource flows within these two competing blocks, not just within the old, Western-led system.
We're going to make similar mistakes in the future if we wage a Cold War when that's no longer the situation where we can win anything. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Before we jump into the second half of today's show, I wanted to thank you for your very generous response to our fundraising efforts this year, and in particular in the last couple of months. And in part responding to that, we are extending the availability of our limited edition linen-covered hardcover version of Understanding Capitalism, the book I wrote and that we have been making available now for quite a while. If you are interested, I will be signing copies of that hardcover, and they will be available to you as they have been over the last few weeks. Just simply send an email to us at info@democracyatwork.info and put in the subject line limited edition. We will send you all the information you need to order and receive your copy, signed copy, of Understanding Capitalism in its hardback. And thank you again for your kind attention to the fundraising dimension of what we do. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I want to turn now to another signal program of the Trump administration and to give you an update about that. As of May 1st, 121,000 federal workers were laid off their jobs. 121,000. That does not include those who took voluntary early retirement and those, and I quote now, placed on administrative leave. So those two categories are thousands more. So 121,000 straight out laid off, and X thousands, because I can't get the numbers, more. Most agencies of the government were subject to a demand from Elon Musk, supported by Mr. Trump, to cut 10% of their workforce. Some entire agencies were either ended or deprived of all their workers. Here, things like American Agency for International Development, AID, and the Department of Education, a cabinet post. The largest government agency, which, in case you didn't know it, was the Veterans Administration. We have fought many wars in our country's history. Targeted to lose 15% of its employees, which is alone 70,000 people. They haven't been laid off yet, but that's the plan. One program that got cut caught my eye. And I think it's a wonderful example of what happens when you have this kind of broad-based, massive slashing of jobs, which we haven't seen before by any administration. There is a program, I'm sure many of you didn't ever heard of it, in the Veterans Administration to provide mortgage support for veterans threatened by foreclosure if they haven't been able to make 2 or 3 consecutive mortgage payments. There was a program where, if and when that happened, veterans could apply to the Veterans Administration for special help if their circumstances merited it. Well, they can't anymore because that program is cut.
Cutting a mortgage support program for veterans is more than just a callous political move. It's a powerful economic signal. We're talking about massive, indiscriminate budget cuts at a time when underlying economic fragility is increasing. 121,000 federal workers laid off, with tens of thousands more potentially on the way from the Veterans Administration, is not a trivial number. From a macroeconomic perspective, this is a direct, government-induced drag on the economy. These aren't just statistics, they are 121,000 households whose consumption is about to plummet. They will stop going to restaurants, delay buying a new car, and cut back on retail spending. This directly impacts corporate earnings for a wide swath of the economy. More importantly, it signals a specific ideology about the role of government. The idea is to shrink the state, regardless of the consequences. But in a complex modern economy, this creates dangerous vulnerabilities. For example, who is inspecting our food now? Who is managing air traffic control? Who is processing benefits for the elderly and veterans? Slashing the workforce creates operational risks that can cascade through the system in unpredictable ways. For an investor, this creates a new layer of risk. It means you can't rely on government services functioning smoothly. It also indicates that if we do hit a recession, the automatic stabilizers, the government programs that cushion the blow, like unemployment benefits or support programs, are being deliberately weakened. This means any future downturn could be deeper and more prolonged because the safety nets have been shredded. This isn't about being fiscally responsible. It's like removing the air.
I don't know what to tell you about this, but if you thought that government existed to help people get through difficulties, and if you thought that veterans had a kind of particular claim on some such support occasionally in their lives, well, you would be wrong. I want to go back to Trump's tariff program. Because again, even though we've talked about it before, the claim that it's going to bring jobs back, the claim that it's going to bring manufacturing back, these are all empty claims. Mentioning a company doesn't mean it's doing that. Mentioning a company that has told the president it plans to invest billions is not yet a company doing that. And I can assure you, if you're wondering, are there companies who make those plans and make those commitments publicly who then never do it? The answer is loads of them. There's nothing unusual about it. Making a big pronouncement is a PR stunt. If they're opening, shoveling the ground and building, then we have a different situation. You know, alongside of the manufacturing he's bringing back, Mr. Trump made a point of looking for and in fact getting the votes of coal miners in America, the few that are left, because we don't mine coal in the United States very much. The mining of coal has been declining basically since the beginning of this century. So I'm going to give you a statistic. In 2008, U.S. coal production was twice what it was in 2023. In 2023, it was 578 million short tons. So roughly from 2008 to 2023, the vast bulk of the century so far, coal not only declined, it declined by half. Coal is over in large parts. Every president mumbled or bumbled about, I'm going to do something about the decline of coal. They didn't do anything. Or to put it the same way, whatever they did didn't matter. Mr. Trump is continuing in that dubious tradition. I want to turn next to McDonald's hamburgers. The CEO at McDonald's says they've suffered the worst drop in the hamburger business since the pandemic hit in early 2020. So we have a 5-year disaster at McDonald's. If I had time, I would tell you about the current disaster at Starbucks Coffee and a whole bunch of other big chains. What did the CEO say to explain? How do they account for the drop in their business? Answer: the pandemic jacked up prices, and that drove away, his quote, lower income customers by the millions. Oh, this is a polite way of saying we have impoverished Americans to the point that they cannot go to McDonald's with their children the way they once did. Let me offer to the CEO another explanation. Not that what he says is wrong, I don't think so. It's part of the story. But here's another part. Americans feel in their gut that hard economic times are coming. And this time, they felt that way at the last year of Mr. Biden's term too, and the Biden administration ridiculed people's feelings, kept asking, and I talked about it on the show here, kept asking, why do the people not understand how good our economy is? What's the matter with them? Turned out they understood real well. They also voted that way. The Democrats should have paid attention. They didn't. Well, let me give some advice to Democrats and Republicans. This time the economics profession thinks the mass of people are right. The Wall Street Journal, the Economic Times, the financial papers, they all see a recession. That's another polite word for joblessness coming down the pike. No one knows in advance how bad this will be, how long it will last. But cutting back on your expenses, going to a restaurant less often, making your own coffee at home, these are all the behaviors of smart working class people who sense what's coming and don't want to be caught not having prepared for it.
Wolff connects the dots perfectly between the struggles at McDonald's and Starbucks and the gut feeling of the average person. The U.S. economy is approximately 70% consumer spending. When that consumer starts to pull back, it's the most reliable recession signal there is. The CEO of McDonald's blaming the pandemic for jacking up prices is only half the story. The prices were jacked up, but they have not come back down, while real wages for the bottom 50% of earners have been decimated by inflation. People aren't just cutting back on McDonald's because they feel like a recession is coming, they're cutting back because they are running out of money. Credit card debt is at an all-time high, savings rates are at historic lows, and pandemic-era stimulus is a distant memory. The lower-income customer is no longer just the very poor, it's now a huge portion of the middle class. For investors, this is a crucial real-time indicator that is often more accurate than official government data. When you see bellwether consumer companies like McDonald's, Starbucks, Target, and Home Depot all report slowing sales and specifically mention customers trading down or reducing purchases, you are witnessing the beginning of a broad-based economic contraction. This is the moment to become defensive in your portfolio. It suggests that consumer discretionary stocks, companies that sell wants, not needs, are likely to get hit hard, while consumer staples, companies that sell necessities like toothpaste and basic food items, will hold up better. The stock market may be hitting new highs, but the view from the McDonald's drive-thru is telling a very different, and much more honest, story.
The last economic update I have time for, and I've tried to leave enough time, is to bring to your attention a very profound reality. It's about Europe, and you might think, well, Europe's far away. It's closer than ever. Here's the reality. At the beginning of this century, early 2003-4, Europe had a bigger economy than the United States. Now, on one hand, that should surprise no one, because if you add up the entire population of Europe, it's double, more than double, what the population of the United States was and is then. So the fact, which it is, that their economy was $1.5 trillion bigger than the American should surprise no one. It's actually a testimony to how well the United States is, because it's only half their population, and yet it's a lot closer than half to their economics. But here's what I want you to think about most interestingly. If you move forward and take a look today, the European economy is not only not $1.5 trillion bigger than the U.S., but it trails the United States, and by a lot. $9.5 trillion. The U.S. economy is $9.5 trillion larger than the European. Now, what is going on here?
The statistic presented here is absolutely staggering and should be a flashing red light for anyone invested in the global economy. 20 years ago, Europe's economy was larger than that of the United States. Today, the U.S. economy is $9.5 trillion larger than Europe's. This isn't just a minor fluctuation, it's a continental-scale economic collapse happening in slow motion. The speaker points to the true cause. It's not so much about America's spectacular growth as it is about Europe's self-inflicted disaster. The primary catalyst was energy policy. By sanctioning their cheapest and most reliable source of energy from Russia and becoming dependent on vastly more expensive American LNG, European industry, particularly in Germany, lost its single biggest competitive advantage. You cannot run a heavy industrial economy on expensive, intermittent energy. It's impossible. The result is what we're seeing now: deindustrialization, recession in Germany, and economic stagnation across the continent. This economic decay is the direct cause of the political turmoil the speaker mentions. The rise of figures like Nigel Farage in the UK and the Alternative for Germany, AfD, is not happening in a vacuum. It is a direct result of the mainstream political parties, both left and right, overseeing a catastrophic decline in living standards for the average person. When people feel their economic future is being destroyed, they turn to political outsiders who promise radical change. From an investment standpoint, the conclusion is unavoidable. Europe, for the foreseeable future, is largely uninvestable outside of a few select luxury brands. The continent faces a perfect storm of crippling energy costs, unfavorable demographics, and rising political instability. The idea of the euro seriously challenging the US dollar is now a distant memory. This continental decline consolidates the world into two main power blocks, the US-led bloc and the China-led BRICS bloc. Europe, once a central player, is increasingly becoming a fragile and dependent economic backwater caught between them.
Well, the United States has grown, but not that much faster than it did before. No, the real explanation is not so much the growth of the United States as it is an economic disaster in Europe. I cannot overstate this. For example, right now, what was always considered, at least for the last 40 years, the engine powering the European economy, namely Germany, is currently in a recession. What we fear here is already there. They're not only not growing, they're shrinking. The German economy is a disaster. The British economy is a disaster. The working classes in both those countries are very upset. They're turning against the conventional politicians, left and right. Mr. Farage in Great Britain won the local elections a few weeks ago. And who was defeated? The Conservatives and Labour, the old standard establishment parties. Rather like Mr. Trump defeated first the Republican establishment and then the Democratic one in the United States. In Germany, the extreme right wing, Alternative für Deutschland, is doing very, very well, gets the endorsement of Vice President Vance, and threatens and is rejected by all the traditional parties in Germany, who turn against it the way the conservatives and the liberals turned against the Reform Party, as Farage's party is known. The handwriting is on the wall. The European economies are doing again what I point out empires do. The rich and the economically powerful, the CEOs, react to the decline of their economies, wrapped up with the decline of their empires, by holding on to the wealth they've accumulated. So the costs, the pain of a declining empire is offloaded onto the middle and the bottom, the working class and the poor. And they're angry and they're bitter. What did you expect? And you're not doing anything about it. The Europeans keep screaming at the Russians. The Russians control the energy, which is the only hope you have of avoiding a descent that will make Europe not the center of the modern world, as it kind of has been for a long time, but an unimportant sideshow. Wow. When I say the world economy is changing, it is changing more and faster than any of us foresaw.
Let's connect all these dots and dispense with the politically correct, generic analysis you get from mainstream financial news. The picture painted here is not one of cyclical downturns or temporary political squabbles. It is a picture of a fundamental, structural dismantling of the post-World War II economic order, and the United States is on the losing end of its own game. The story begins and ends with the transfer of productive capacity. The tale of the wheelbarrow factory isn't a side story, it is the entire plot. For 40 years, the financial elite of the United States discovered it was more profitable to strip and liquidate American industry than to run it. Vulture capitalists, rebranded as sophisticated private equity managers, became heroes on Wall Street by firing workers, closing factories, and selling brand names to be stamped on cheap foreign goods. This process, repeated thousands of times over, hollowed out the nation's industrial base and made us critically dependent on the one nation that was doing the opposite, China. Now, decades later, the consequences are coming home to roost. The political establishment, having woken up too late, is trying to apply a 1980s Cold War strategy to a 2025 economic reality. They talk tough about tariffs and sanctions, but it's a pathetic bluff. We can't wage a real economic war on China because they are our factory. We can't effectively sanction major powers like Russia because they no longer need our financial system. They have built their own, with the BRICS alliance as its anchor and with over half the world's population as its market. The failed sanctions against Russia were the Sputnik moment for this new era, proving that the emperor of Western financial dominance has no clothes. Meanwhile, the rot is evident at home. The very system that champions offshoring manufacturing now turns on its own government, demanding massive layoffs that further cripple domestic demand. And the American consumer, the engine of the entire globalist model, is running on fumes. They can't afford McDonald's. They are drowning in debt. Their gut feeling of an impending crisis, as the speaker notes, is not ignorance, it is the wisdom of the crowd recognizing that the foundation is rotten. Our traditional allies in Europe are in an even worse state, having committed economic suicide over energy policy, turning their once mighty industrial engine into a museum. So what does this mean for you, the investor? It means you must operate with a level of realism that is completely absent from mainstream political and financial discourse. The narrative of inevitable American dominance is a dangerous fantasy. The real story is one of a financialized, hollowed-out empire trying to use the tactics of its youth against a new set of rivals who have copied our industrial playbook while we abandoned it. The biggest risk to your portfolio is not a recession, it is clinging to a worldview that expired 10 years ago. You must look at the world as it is, a bipolar system where productive capacity, control of commodities, and demographic destiny are shifting east. This requires a radical rethinking of what constitutes a safe asset and a sober understanding that the political promises made in Washington are nothing more than window dressing on a burning building.